Classical music in the present day, I fear, has a dwindling attraction to many ears. But for some of us, including likely many of you, dear viewers, there are those who remain captivated by the genre. It should come as no surprise to any of you, however, that during the Cold War, classical music was on the front lines of the cultural war that raged between East and West. The Soviet Union boasted some of the century's finest composers, from Rachmaninoff to Stravinsky to Khachaturian to Prokofiev. However, one name should stand out above even these giants: Dimitry Dmitrievich Shostakovich. He was an innovative and prolific composer, but was at the same time beholden to the dictates of the state to which he belonged. I'm your host David, and today we are going to explore the life of Dimitry Shostakovich, his changing relationship to the Soviet state, and what all of that tells us about the Cold War. Dimitry Shostakovich was born in St. Petersburg in 1906. He was only 10 years old when in 1917 the revolution happened and the Russian Empire collapsed, with the Bolsheviks establishing themselves into power later that year. He was in his 20s when Stalin rose to power, and only just 30 when the terror swept through Soviet society, dragging Shostakovich along with it. He was not quite 40 by the time the Soviet Union triumphed in one of the most violent and deadly conflicts the world has ever seen, but also not quite 50 when Stalin died. He turned 50 the year Nikita Khrushchev began his thaw, and then he bore witness to Khrushchev being replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. He only passed away as the stagnation of the Soviet 70s was beginning to take hold. Mitya, as he was referred to by select friends and family, bore witness to and was included in many of the key moments of Soviet history. He was at several times a moral compass for Dissident, but other times a willingly compromised tool of the Communist Party. And as a composer, Soviet history was directly reflected in his work, each piece a monument to that moment in time. He was, as they say, a child of the revolution, of each revolution in Soviet history, and that is what makes him so interesting to me from a historical perspective. So, he was born to a comfortable family in St. Petersburg. His mother, musically inclined herself, recognized that the young Dimitry had some talent, and he was enrolled in piano lessons, at which he excelled. He was formally enrolled in the Petrograd Conservatory in 1919 for both piano and for composition. When his father passed away suddenly in 1922, Shostakovich remained enrolled at the conservatory thanks to his mother, who took up a series of jobs in order to ensure his continued musical education. In 1925, at the age of just 19, he wrote his first symphony as part of the requirement for graduation from the conservatory. It was met with strong and positive reviews, which were also tempered by recognition of his young age. The first symphony still has a degree of formalism in it, the influence of the conservatory, but is considered lively and witty, balanced by drama and even tragedy. This can be seen as quite reflective of the Soviet Union at that time, where hope for the bright future of a newly transformative nation was balanced by the struggles of the revolution, the Civil War, and the massive upheavals they had created. In 1927, the, up to that point, politically uninvolved Shostakovich was selected to represent the Soviet Union at its first international piano competition to be held in Poland. He did not win the Chopin competition in Warsaw that year, possibly the result of a bout of appendicitis in the lead-up to the performances, losing out to his fellow Soviet and friend Leva Borin. But despite the setback, if you could call it that, he was determined to pursue his career as a musician and composer. And he did that, taking on work composing scores for the Soviet film industry, which built well on top of the work he had already done during his student days as a piano player in film houses. It was during this time that Shostakovich wrote the work that helped to establish himself on the Soviet music scene, an opera based on Nikolai Gogol's story, The Nose. The work is reflective of the experimentalism of the young artist at the time, combining folk music, atonality, and even popular music, and then structured with more traditional canons and quartets. This musical experimentation, although it may strike some as unusual for the Soviet Union, was in keeping with the arts at the time, where strict state control had not yet been imposed. The Nose first debuted in 1929, but with only the music of the opera being played. A full stage performance was not mounted until 1930. The nose was met with poor reviews from critics and other artists due to its experimental construction, but despite this, it was modestly successful with audiences, and the stage version was performed 16 times over a period of 6 months, before history would relegate it to the shadows. His 1932 marriage to Nina Vasilyevna Varzar inspired a new opera, one which would not only solidify his international standing, but mark him as a nonconformist in a society which was increasingly demanding conformity. Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk was based on an 1865 novella by Nikolai Leskov. The music was more formal in nature than some of Shostakovich's earlier work, moving away somewhat from the avant-garde. This work, first debuting in 1934, was well received by Soviet critics, but was very well received by audiences, and it was performed regularly over the next 2 years, several hundred times in the Soviet Union, and several international series of performances as well. Shostakovich became an anchor of the Soviet cultural scene. Now, before I explain what happened next, let's keep in mind that, to this point, Shostakovich had shown no reluctance to work with the state. Although he was not overtly political, he was sympathetic to the Soviet project and had accepted commissions from the state, including his Second Symphony. His film scores were all for movies that, in one way or another, were being created to fit with and promote Soviet ideals. This helped to magnify the devastating events that were about to unfold. In January of 1936, Comrade Stalin, who had a reputation as an opera lover, attended a performance of Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, with Shostakovich in attendance. Stalin did not stay for the entirety of the performance, having been seen to visibly cringe at times through the opera. 2 days later, an unsigned editorial was published in Pravda entitled "Muddle Instead of Music." The editorial referred to the music as coarse, primitive, and vulgar, and of being nervous, convulsive, and spasmodic. The article also attacked Shostakovich directly, challenging his class consciousness and accusing him of ignoring the demands of Soviet culture. Although it was suspected to have been written by Stalin at the time, it's been concluded by Shostakovich scholars like Pauline Fairclough that the article was actually written at the direction of Stalin by the playwright David Soslavsky, a senior editor at Pravda. This denunciation was a huge blow for Shostakovich. As described by Fairclough, quote, "Overnight, Shostakovich was transformed from the Soviet Union's most feted composer to someone whose name could hardly be mentioned without reference to his crimes against the art of music." While he was spared from a public excoriation, he was forced to submit himself to the head of the Artists' Union and request guidance and direction in his music. He was also required to submit any of his future work for pre-screening to ensure it met the requirements of socialist realism, meaning his future works were to be, in the words of Fairclough, accessible and party-minded in guiding Soviet citizens to look at all times towards a brighter future. As the purge intensified, Shostakovich found himself with several options. He could rebel against the authorities, or he could simply accept the newly imposed reality. He seems to have picked a more hybrid approach, however, by simply accepting the criticism and accepting the dictates of the state, while still continuing to compose as he wanted. We can see this in his Fourth Symphony, which was, by all accounts, largely complete before the Pravda article. He made few changes to the work based on the criticisms in the denunciation, and the Fourth was planned to debut in 1936. The work itself was deemed to be very formalist in nature, the antithesis of socialist realism, and yet Shostakovich persisted. It was only at the very last minute, on the insistence of the Composers' Union and at the urging of many of the musicians in the orchestra itself, that the work was formally withdrawn and shelved until it was performed finally for the first time in 1961. Despite this attempt to remain true to his artistry, the terror did have a deep and profound impact on Shostakovich. Despite interventions with senior leadership, including Stalin, by such luminaries as Maxim Gorky and Marshal Tukhachevsky, he remained on the blacklist. In fact, his relationship with Tukhachevsky, who had been a sponsor and patron of his since the 1920s, actually endangered him further as the Marshal himself fell under suspicion. Following Tukhachevsky's arrest, Shostakovich was even interrogated by the NKVD, with an arrest warrant being drawn up that only failed to be executed because the interrogator himself was arrested in the meantime. Shostakovich was so concerned about his possible arrest and the psychological impact it would have on his young family that he slept in a room near the front door with a packed bag, anticipating arrest. Now, there's no clear or defined reason why or how he escaped being purged. Perhaps his international reputation provided him some cover, or perhaps it was his willingness to publicly accept criticism, or perhaps it was just plain luck. But he did survive and would go on in short order to write what is often seen as his triumphal work. Despite the extreme financial hardship that he and his family endured after the Pravda article, Shostakovich wrote his Fifth Symphony as a response to the denunciation, with the final movement being set to Pushkin's poem Rebirth. And that is what the symphony symbolized, a rebirth of Shostakovich on the public scene. It was met with public and critical success, despite differing reasons for this. The critics deemed that it met the necessary corrections to Shostakovich's work that had been meted out the year before, therefore making it politically acceptable. For the public, it was a piece evocative of mourning, with callbacks to the Orthodox Requiem. In reality, as Fairclough has pointed out, the only major difference between the Fourth Symphony and the Fifth Symphony was that the first ended in a minor key, while the second one ended in a major key. The fifth concluded not with the dying of the light, but in a blaze of glory. In the words of historian Richard H.R. White, quote, "He had mastered the technique of expressing fear, anger, and joy, and had learned how to secretly mock the authorities." This is where we start to see the duality of Shostakovich begin to emerge, the publicly loyal and subservient agent of the state versus the private man creating the music he wanted. Restored to the regime's good graces, Shostakovich resumed a place in society. He took up teaching again, and his earlier work was again able to be performed. Despite his ongoing fear of being arrested and exiled or executed, despite the ongoing terror, life went back to normal. So much so that in 1940, he was even awarded a Stalin Prize for his piano quintet. These series of events only work to demonstrate that beyond the vagaries of chance and happenstance, obedience allowed for life to carry on as normal. In the summer of 1941, things changed for Shostakovich and for the Soviet Union. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, Leningrad was a key target, and German forces quickly advanced on the city. Shostakovich was quick to answer the call and volunteered for combat duty, but was rejected, not only due to ongoing health issues, but because it wouldn't do to have the world-renowned composer killed when he would be far more useful creating inspirational music to motivate, rouse, and unite the nation. Now, this didn't stop Shostakovich from joining the Home Guard, and he served as part of a firefighting brigade during the early part of the siege of Leningrad. Laurel has well pointed out, however, that even in this role, his fellow Leningraders protected him without his knowledge and tried to ensure he never had to do any actual firefighting. It was during these months, however, that he wrote what is perhaps his most inspirational work, his Seventh Symphony, nicknamed the Leningrad Symphony. Although likely begun before the German invasion itself, the work began to take shape as a tribute to the besieged city, especially after Shostakovich and his family found themselves trapped in the city after September, having resisted efforts from others to evacuate. Work continued on the piece over the next month before Shostakovich and his wife and children were evacuated to Kuybyshev, where the work was finally completed. Large, bombastic, raw, and reliant on emotions, the Seventh conveys the story of invasion and of siege and terror. Although it has fallen foul of later critics, the Seventh was used to its fullest for propaganda purposes. It debuted in the USSR in March of 1942, being performed first in Kuybyshev and then Moscow, but it wasn't only performed extensively in the Soviet Union. The score was microfilmed and sent to Western allies. It was performed in London in June of 1942 and then New York in July. Its Leningrad debut had to wait until August 9th of that year, and the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra, the only ensemble left in the city, had to be assembled. With only 15 members still alive in the city, the rest either having starved or gone to fight the Germans, a general search was made for players and an orchestra was reformed. On the night of the Leningrad performance, a pre-planned bombardment of German lines was conducted to allow the music, being played over loudspeakers pointed towards the enemy, to be played uninterrupted. The Seventh was a massive success during the war years, with even America's Life magazine telling Americans in 1942 that, quote, "It is almost unpatriotic not to like Dimitry Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony." At home, as Shostakovich was being considered for another Stalin Prize, the actor and director Solomon Michols put forward the following defense to the committee. We, the builders of the future, should be especially attentive to those artists who are able to sense the future, who outstrip their time. Shostakovich is just such an artist. Shostakovich spent the rest of the war writing his 8th and 9th symphonies, both intended as part of a wartime trilogy alongside the 7th. While both fell critically short of expectations, they were comfortably received by audiences, and the composer continued on his path, including a further exploration of Jewish folk music and Jewish themes, some of which had found their way into the 9th Symphony. Despite the growing anti-Semitism of the period, it was considered traditional music of the people and didn't fall foul of the critics. Now, in spite of increasing artistic and literary controls being imposed, at the behest of Stalin, by Andrei Zhdanov, referred to as the Zhdanovshchina, the immediate post-war was good for the composer. He won a Stalin Prize for his Piano Trio No. 2 and was awarded the Order of Lenin for his work, the highest civilian award that could be bestowed in the Soviet Union. He was composing, teaching at the conservatories in Moscow and Leningrad, and involved in the All Composers Union. Life was comfortable. And then the February 1948 denunciation happened. Accused of writing formalist music rather than accessible proletarian music, he was dismissed from his teaching positions, as well as all his political appointments. He was subject to in-person criticism at the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Composers. And, like in 1936, he publicly accepted the criticism. Well, technically, it was only his formalist pieces that were banned. No musicians would touch any of his work for fear that the banned list would be expanded and they would find themselves in the crosshairs of the Soviet security apparatus. So his music was just not performed. He and his family were forced to live on the meager income Shostakovich could get from composing several film scores, deemed acceptable because of the distance between the audience and the composer. They also depleted their savings, as well as borrowed money from friends and extended family. Shostakovich at this time is reported to have contemplated suicide. And then suddenly, it all changed once more when he received a phone call. On the morning of March 16, 1949, Shostakovich received a personal phone call at his home from none other than Joseph Stalin. The Vozhd personally reached out to ask Shostakovich why he would not attend the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, which was to be held in New York. Shostakovich had been asked to go but declined, as he felt, because of the denunciation, he would not be in a position to best represent the Soviet Union, as his music was forbidden. Stalin's alleged response was to play innocent. What do you mean, forbidden? Forbidden by whom? By the end of the day, Order No. 3197 was issued, declaring the February 1948 repertoire ban illegal, and even reprimanding the Committee on the Arts that had issued the ban. How could the artist say no, especially since he recognized that, in the words of historian Philip Deary, his path to rehabilitation lay in traveling to New York. So what was in New York that Stalin had deemed so important? Well, the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, which has become known simply as the Waldorf Conference after the hotel at which it was held, was an attempt by some American leftist organizations, along with the Common Forum, to bring some sway to the American public in favor of the Soviet Union. The participation of an artistic luminary such as Shostakovich at such an event was deemed paramount given his positive reputation outside of the Soviet Union. Once in New York and in attendance at the conference, Shostakovich followed through with the expectations of him. When asked if he, as a composer, agreed with the call by Pravda to ban formalists, Shostakovich's response was that he fully agreed with the statement made in Pravda. His speech to the conference, which we should point out was highly likely to have actually been written by somebody else, was read out by a translator while Shostakovich sat reportedly arms crossed and staring forward, was an attack against Western leaders as a, quote, small clique of warmongers, decrying their outright aggression. The 5,200-word speech renounced bourgeois formalism and accepted the criticism against his own music, leveled in the 1948 denunciation. He even attacked a fellow composer, the disgraced Sergei Prokofiev. The planned 2-week tour of several other American cities had then to be cancelled as the State Department withdrew the Soviet delegation's visas and they returned to the USSR. So, Waldorf should be seen as Shostakovich's penance for past transgressions. Upon his return, he was re-invited back into society and resumed work as a public composer, as a teacher, and his involvement in the composers' unions. He had gone to New York and become, quote, an ideal symbol and articulator of Soviet propaganda. But by doing so, we should ask the question if he had betrayed the music and the art which he created. In the words of Deary, integrity was traded for survival. For Shostakovich, the split in his public versus his private life, one that had begun to emerge after the 1936 denunciation and subsequent redemption, deepened. He continued to work privately on music that interested him, but that he also knew would never be debuted. This included an intensification in his exploration of Jewish themes, which some have attributed as a quiet mockery of Stalin's rapidly intensifying anti-Semitism. Stalin's death in 1953 was a watershed moment for the nation. For Shostakovich, the eventual liberalization meant a renewed freedom in which his works could be performed. But, as Fairclough has pointed out, quote, as a composer, Shostakovich had evolved under Stalinism in a particular way, and by 1953, that was simply who he was. He had made public compromises, substantial ones, in order to be able to continue his work, and as the thaw began over the following years, he was simply able to publicly reveal work that had been written previously, but had been unacceptable. The death of his wife Nina in 1954 was a devastating blow for the composer. Not only had their somewhat open marriage provided stability at home for Dimitry while allowing infatuation and dalliances to inspire his writing, but Nina ran the family and home life. A short and unsuccessful marriage to Margaret Kainova did nothing to alleviate this, and it wasn't until his 1962 marriage to the much younger Irina Supinskaya that this balance was restored. During that time, Shostakovich returned to symphonic composition, including the 10th, written not long after Stalin's death, and marked by an ever-increasing triumphal tone. At no point in the work is there a slow section or a lament. You can listen to that and take from it what you will. His 11th symphony, a tribute to the 1905 revolution, drew attention, good and bad, for its inspiration. Critics, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, criticized its embrace of revolution as a positive ideal. On the other hand, supporters of the work, including the poet Anna Akhmatova, praised the work's embrace of the original ideals of the revolution. By the late 1950s, Shostakovich was firmly established as a member of the Soviet elite. He had an apartment, a dacha, and was even able to travel internationally with relatively few restrictions. During these trips abroad, he took the opportunity to expose himself to musical ideas and themes that were still not acceptable back home, including an exploration of dodecaphonic music, a 12-tone technique most often associated to modernism. Now, these privileges did come with a price. He could make no claim to be a moral opponent to the regime. But for all his status, to this point, he was not a member of the party. This changed in 1960, when, under pressure from Khrushchev, he was all but forced to join. There's been a lot of debate surrounding why he would join. He was already established as a societal elite, a role model for the status quo, a malleable symbol of the fusion of civic responsibility with artistic genius, of popularity with professional respect, to quote Laurel. The reason likely has less to do with Shostakovich and more to do with Khrushchev's attempt to actively recruit members to the intelligentsia into the party. Shostakovich, with no strong public character, was likely simply swept up amidst the pressure. But in many ways, this marked the death of Shostakovich as any possible opponent to the regime. As described by Fay, quote, he was neither the first nor the last to realize, too late, that the path to accommodation with the Soviet system was one of no return. This did not stop the next round of controversy in Shostakovich's work, the 13th Symphony, Babi Yar. The music was set to the poem of the same name written by the young poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, written about the ravine outside Kiev where tens of thousands of Jewish citizens were slaughtered over the course of days and weeks during the German occupation of the city. The poem had already been banned in Ukraine, so finding orchestras willing to perform the work was difficult. Then, adding to this, the premiere of the work in December 1962 was only 2 weeks after Khrushchev's public condemnation of modernism at the Manezh Art Gallery in Moscow. While the 13th was very well received by public audiences, it was officially ignored. The state had changed from banning work it did not approve of to simply pretending that it did not exist. The rest of the 1960s for Shostakovich was one of continued work, but of physical decline. a weakening of his right hand, eventually diagnosed as poliomyelitis, as well as a series of heart attacks magnified by a lifetime of smoking and drinking, had left him physically compromised. By this time also, he was no longer considered to be a cutting-edge composer, instead firmly a tool of the state. He continued to travel and even to compose, as best as he was able to anyway, including the 15th Symphony, which he specifically wrote for his son Maxim to conduct at its premiere. On a trip to the United States undertaken at this time, his wife Irina booked a visit for him at the National Institute of Health, where a previous Soviet diagnosis of incurable lung cancer was proclaimed. In 1973, perhaps one of his most controversial actions was undertaken. His name was included on a list of Soviet artists condemning the physicist-turned-dissident Andrei Sakharov for his actions against the state. There are some questions as to whether his name was added without his acceptance or even knowledge, but he did not raise any public concerns over his inclusion on the list. As a result, the dying man, already largely viewed as a symbol of the past and complicit in sanctioning the actions of the regime, was shunned by many of his friends and colleagues. For a man who had clearly chosen to focus his attention on the private aspects of his life, the things that brought him joy, primarily his family, this was yet one more event in his life that he would need to ride out before being brought back into the good graces of society. Or not. Dimitry Shostakovich died on August 9, 1975. Although he had become a giant of 20th century classical music, his obituary, which was headed by the signature of Leonid Brezhnev, said far less about his music and instead focused on his service to the state and to communism. Now, some of you will notice that I have made no mention of Testimony, the memoirs of Dimitry Shostakovich, a book published in 1979 after Shostakovich's death by the Soviet musicologist Solomon Volkov. While purported to be Shostakovich's memoir, the book itself is disputed, with much of the text purporting to be Shostakovich's thoughts very closely mirroring Volkov's own published opinions. The original of the book has never been made available for academic scrutiny, and while some members of the Shostakovich family accepted the authenticity of the book, it has been rejected by others, including his wife Irina. Given the controversy surrounding the book and its provenance, I have elected to exclude it from this work. So, with all this being said, what does it mean? Why did we choose to produce this episode? Well, Shostakovich is a representative of a set of choices that existed in the Soviet Union. The West lauds the dissidents, those who stood up to the regime and more often than not, paid a tremendous price. There were the true believers, those that bought into the system wholeheartedly and committed themselves to the regime in its many changing forms. There were those who simply kept their heads down, remained as uninvolved as they could, and tried to live their lives. But there are those like Dimitry Shostakovich, who were committed to exploring their own creative process, who looked to build something new but ran afoul of the regime, and instead of standing up to it, bowed down to it. Perhaps this can be seen as a moral weakness, or perhaps it should be seen as a man who understood the system, bent the knee as necessary, lived within it, but created what could be created with the idea that it could become relevant at a later time. He was also a man who made a decision to protect his family. By living within the system, even absorbing the abuses and capricious nature inherent to it, he worked to ensure that he was there to provide for his family and to keep them safe. The price to pay, of course, was to live his life as a compromised figure with compromised public morals. Shostakovich, to me, is a man who did what he felt he needed to do to ensure that not only would he survive multiple periods of trauma, but also to ensure his family survived with him. No easy choice in the face of authoritarianism, and one which I suspect many would equally fail when placed in similar circumstances. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is different from the triangle, a percussion instrument which is surprisingly difficult to play appropriately. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.